I wasn't looking for a job, but the job found me. One evening, as I was scrolling through the usual online listings, a peculiar ad caught my eye. It was simple. One sentence, no frills, just a phone number and a brief description. Night janitor needed at an abandoned airport. Immediate start. Pay is more than competitive. It seemed like the kind of ad that wasn't real. An abandoned airport? Why would they need a janitor for a place like that? But curiosity got the better of me. The pay offered was exactly what I needed to cover some overdue bills, so I decided to call. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, but there was an urgency in the way they spoke. "Can you start tonight?" the voice asked. I told them I could. They gave me the address, and I hung up the phone, still feeling skeptical. But something about the situation piqued my interest. An abandoned airport, sitting on the outskirts of town, had to be a story in itself. And, if nothing else, it would pay well. I set out that evening, following the directions given to me. The airport wasn't far from the main highway, tucked away in a place where the world seemed to slip away into silence. The further I drove, the more isolated the place became. There were no street lights, no signs of life, just an empty road leading to what looked like a forgotten relic. When I arrived, I didn't know what to expect, but I certainly didn't think I'd see what I saw. The airport was enormous. It had the faded, worn look of a place that hadn't seen a plane in decades. The terminal was dark, with only a single light flickering weakly near the entrance. The parking lot was empty, save for a single, rusty van parked near the entrance. The place felt more like a ghost town than an airport. I half expected someone to walk out of the shadows and tell me it was all a joke, but there was no one. The door creaked open when I pushed it, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. The walls were lined with old, peeling advertisements and weathered benches that had long been abandoned by travelers. The ticket counters were empty, and the security checkpoints looked like they had been untouched for years. It was as if the place had just stopped. A man in his mid-50s, wearing a faded uniform, was waiting for me by the desk. His eyes were tired, but there was something about him. Something uncomfortably calm. "You must be the new janitor," he said, his voice low. "I'm Walter. I'll show you around." He led me through the terminal, explaining the few duties I had to perform. Sweeping, mopping, checking the bathrooms, making sure the place didn't look completely abandoned. It was simple work, but the setting felt wrong. Walter's demeanor was odd, like he'd been working here for far too long. He moved slowly, with an almost ritualistic precision, and there was a strange tension in his every word, as if he was holding something back. "Don't worry," he said, noticing my hesitation as I followed him down the dimly lit halls. "The plane's in Hangar 2. Just make sure no one's been in there and keep your distance. We don't get too many visitors around here anymore." I nodded, not sure what to say. The plane? What did he mean by that? The airport was supposed to be abandoned, but as Walter led me to the back of the terminal, I saw it, through the large glass windows at the far end of the building. A plane. It was sitting there, alone in the hangar, perfectly intact. It looked like it had been preserved in time. The paint on the plane's body was slightly chipped, and the tail number was faded. But there it was, an aircraft that seemed entirely out of place. There was no sign of life around it, no ground crew, no passengers, just the eerie silence that seemed to hang over everything. Walter gave me a quick, knowing look as he led me back toward the janitor's closet. "Just stay out of the hangar unless you're told otherwise," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "The plane never leaves." I didn't ask what he meant by that. I didn't want to know. I just nodded, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I closed the door behind me and prepared to start my first shift. The quiet of the airport felt like it was swallowing me whole. I was alone in a vast building, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But it wasn't my job to ask questions. I just had to get through the night. The first night passed uneventfully. I swept the terminal, mopped the floors, and checked the restrooms, all while trying to shake the eerie feeling that clung to me like a second skin. The silence of the airport was stifling, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling or the hum of the dim overhead lights. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the corners of the rooms. But there was nothing. Just empty halls, abandoned lounges, and the distant shape of the plane in Hangar 2. Walter had been around a few times during my shift, checking in on me and giving me the occasional instruction. His presence was calming, though his eyes always seemed distant, as if he was lost in his own thoughts. When he wasn't around, I found myself wandering the empty terminal, unable to focus on the monotonous task at hand. As midnight approached, the place felt even more deserted. The clock ticked loudly in the otherwise still room, each second feeling like it dragged on longer than the last. I found myself standing near the windows overlooking the hangar, my eyes drawn to the plane again. It sat there, motionless, bathed in the weak glow of the dim lights that lined the hangar. The silence that surrounded it was almost oppressive. I couldn't explain why, but something about the plane felt wrong. Walter's voice broke through the stillness, startling me. "You're doing a good job, but don't spend too much time near the hangar, all right?" He was standing behind me, his face stern. I nodded quickly, turning away from the window. "Yeah, no problem. Just getting the hang of things." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes lingering on the hangar. Then, almost as if he had to force the words out, he said, "You'll get used to it. Just keep doing your job, and you'll be fine." I wasn't sure what he meant by fine, but I didn't ask. It wasn't my place. I turned my attention back to the terminal, trying to push the strange feeling out of my mind. The hangar had no business being there. It was just a plane, after all. Nothing unusual about that. The rest of the night was quiet. The janitor's closet smelled like old cleaning supplies, and I kept myself busy with the usual tasks. But around 2 a.m., something changed. I had just finished cleaning the bathrooms when I heard it. A faint sound coming from the direction of the hangar. It was soft at first, like the whisper of something moving in the distance. Then it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew the airport was supposed to be abandoned. There was no one else around. Walter had made it clear that I would be alone for the shift. Yet, there it was. The unmistakable sound of footsteps walking slowly across the hangar floor. I couldn't make myself move. The footsteps were deliberate, methodical, as though someone was walking inside the hangar, pacing back and forth. My eyes darted toward the window again, but all I could see was the shape of the plane, motionless as ever. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to go find Walter, but I stayed rooted to the spot. The sound was too real to ignore. I slowly walked toward the door to the hangar, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. With a deep breath, I turned it and stepped into the corridor that led to the hangar. The air was colder here, and the floor creaked beneath my feet. I made my way slowly toward the hangar, keeping to the shadows. As I approached the large steel doors, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I paused in front of the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me told me not to open it. Something wasn't right. The plane had never left, and it felt like it never would. But then I heard something else. A low, rumbling sound, like an engine starting. It was muffled at first, but then it grew louder, like the sound of a plane preparing for takeoff. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't understand. Every instinct told me to back away, but I couldn't tear myself away from the noise. Slowly, I grabbed the door handle and pushed it open. The hangar was empty. The plane sat exactly where it had been before. No lights, no movement. The engine noise had stopped, replaced by the haunting stillness of the room. Confused, I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. I scanned the hangar, but saw nothing unusual. Just the plane, as lifeless as ever. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. Was it the wind? Was it my imagination? I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the hangar, near the far wall, a figure stood. It was tall, with a shadowy silhouette, and it didn't move. It just stood there, facing the plane, unmoving. I couldn't make out any details, just the dark shape of a person, frozen in place. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to look away. But I had no choice. With my heart pounding, I slowly turned and bolted back toward the door, shutting it behind me as fast as I could. I leaned against the cold metal door, gasping for breath. What was that? Who was in there with the plane? There shouldn't have been anyone. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but it was too much. Whatever was going on in that hangar, it was far worse than I had ever imagined. I wasn't supposed to see what I just saw. Something, someone, was waiting for me inside. I ran back to the janitor's closet, locking the door behind me. But as I sat there in the darkness, I knew one thing for sure. I was not alone in that airport. After the incident in the hangar, sleep was impossible. I kept replaying the image of the shadowy figure, standing motionless in the corner, its presence like a cold, suffocating fog. The airport felt even more like a ghost town than before, its silence amplified by my own growing anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. When Walter arrived the next morning, he didn't ask about the hangar or the strange footsteps I had heard. He simply gave me a nod, a tired smile, and handed me the keys to lock up for the night. He knew I had heard something, but he didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. We both knew the unspoken rule. Don't ask, don't question, just do your job. But as I locked the gates and stepped inside that night, I could feel the weight of what I had experienced. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights seemed amplified. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the hangar. Who had it been? What did it want? And most importantly, why was it there? The hours passed slowly as I went through my usual rounds, sweeping the terminal, mopping the floors, checking the restrooms. But every task felt like a chore now, each one keeping me away from the hangar, from the place where I knew something was waiting. It was hard to focus, to ignore the nagging fear that gripped me. Then, at exactly midnight, it happened again. The footsteps. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. The sound was unmistakable, heavy, rhythmic, like someone pacing back and forth. I froze, my heart in my throat. It was coming from the hangar. No one was supposed to be there. No one was supposed to be in the building. But the sound was real. It was impossible to ignore. I stood in the middle of the terminal, paralyzed by indecision. Should I go and investigate? Should I call Walter? I couldn't explain it, but every instinct told me to avoid the hangar at all costs. The plane was just sitting there, lifeless, but there was something about it, something that didn't sit right with me. I didn't want to go near the hangar, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the back hallway, slowly, quietly. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached the door to the hangar. I paused, my breath shallow, waiting for some sign, anything that would explain what I was hearing. But there was nothing. The silence was unbearable. The hangar doors were cracked slightly, just enough for me to squeeze through. I hesitated, staring at the plane through the narrow gap. It was still there, exactly as I had left it. But as I peered inside, I noticed something different. The lights above the hangar had turned on. They hadn't been on when I last looked. I hadn't touched any switches. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stepped through the door, my flashlight flickering in my hand as I made my way toward the plane. The floor was cold beneath my shoes, and the air smelled musty, like something had been dormant for far too long. The hangar felt wrong. The silence was oppressive, stifling. As I got closer to the plane, I saw the faintest movement from the corner of my eye. Something shifted, a shadow darting just out of sight. I turned, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the cold steel of the hangar and the plane, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel something, someone watching me, but there was no one to be seen. I stepped forward again, my flashlight beam sweeping across the plane, and that's when I saw it. There, near the cockpit, was a figure. A man, standing in the shadows, just barely visible. His face was obscured by the dim lighting, but I could tell he wasn't a part of the airport. He wasn't a worker, a traveler, or anyone I had seen before. The figure stood still, his body rigid, as though he were waiting for something or someone. I froze. I should have backed away. I should have called out or run for the door, but I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, and the figure's presence felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the plane as though he were connected to it, as though he belonged there. And then, without warning, the figure vanished. I blinked, and he was gone, just like that. One moment, he was there, and the next, he had disappeared, as if he had never been there at all. My heart was racing now, the fear clawing at my insides. What was happening in this place? I stepped back toward the door, my mind reeling with questions. Was it a hallucination? Was I imagining things? No, it couldn't be. I had seen him. The figure had been real, and whatever connection he had with the plane. I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing for sure. I had to get out of that hangar. I rushed back to the janitor's closet, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I leaned against the cold metal. I tried to calm myself, to make sense of what had happened. But there was no explanation. The plane was still there. The figure had vanished. And yet, the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave. I glanced at the clock. It was 1:45 a.m. I still had hours left in my shift, but I knew I couldn't stay in the hangar again. I had to get through the night. But the question lingered in my mind. Why was the plane still here? And why did the figure appear only to disappear? The plane had never left, and now I was starting to wonder if it ever would. The hours crawled by, each second feeling longer than the last. I stayed in the janitor's closet for as long as I could, but the fear that had taken root in my chest refused to let go. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the hangar, the way he had just vanished, as if he was a ghost. I kept telling myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had seen something, or someone, and whatever it wasn't supposed to be here. After what felt like an eternity, I finally decided to step out of the closet. I had to keep working. The job was simple: sweep the floors, mop the hallways, and check the bathrooms. There was no reason to go near the hangar again. I could get through the night if I just focused on the tasks at hand. But as I moved through the terminal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air seemed heavier, colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move in and out of my peripheral vision. I kept hearing sounds, soft whispers, distant footsteps, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing, just the same abandoned airport. At 3 a.m., I found myself back in the terminal, walking past the check-in desks and through the empty waiting areas. I noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from the corner of the room. It wasn't bright, but it was there, flickering like the light of a lantern. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the glow, stepping deeper into the terminal. I turned a corner and found myself standing near the old baggage claim area. The glow was coming from behind the counter, just out of sight. I walked closer, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. As I neared the counter, I froze. There, sitting on top of the counter, was an old suitcase. It was worn, faded, with scuff marks on the leather. But what struck me most was the way it seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as if it were alive. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why was this suitcase here? No one had come through this airport in years. I stepped forward, hesitant, but something drew me to it. I reached out and touched the handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. My fingers tightened around it, and I tried to lift it, but it was surprisingly heavy. Something inside shifted as I moved it, a soft, muffled sound, like a deep breath. A rush of panic surged through me. What was inside the suitcase? And why was it here, in an abandoned airport, just sitting in the dark? Suddenly, the terminal lights flickered, and the soft, distant hum of the airport system seemed to come to life. The suitcase seemed to pulse in my hands, and I felt a compulsion to open it, as if it were calling to me. But I hesitated. Something told me I wasn't ready to know what was inside. I put the suitcase back on the counter, carefully setting it down. But before I could turn away, I heard a noise, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Tap, tap, tap. I spun around, searching for the source of the sound. The terminal was empty. But then I noticed it, the faintest movement in the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just outside the baggage claim area. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was dressed in a dark coat, its features obscured by the dim lighting. It was tall, too tall to be anyone I had seen before. It stood motionless, just like the figure in the hangar. The shadows seemed to bend around it, making it appear even more unnatural, more otherworldly. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I felt its gaze on me, as if it was watching me, waiting for something. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get away from whatever was in front of me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure stepped into the shadows and was gone. Just like that. vanished into thin air. I took a step forward, my pulse racing. What had just happened? Was it the same figure? Was it the same presence I had felt in the hangar? I didn't have time to think about it. The suitcase, the figure, the strange noises. It was all too much. My head was spinning, my heart pounding as I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of it all. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this place before it drove me mad. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The door to the hangar was slightly ajar. The hangar, the plane that never left. I should have gone back to the janitor's closet, locked the door, and waited for the shift to end. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to understand what was going on in that hangar. Against my better judgment, I moved toward the door. It creaked as I pushed it open, the cold air from inside the hangar rushing out to greet me. The plane sat where it had been before, still and silent. But as I stepped inside, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. Something was different. The air was thicker, almost like I was walking through fog. I turned to look at the cockpit, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, just the faintest shadow moving across the plane's interior. I blinked, and it was gone, but something was still there, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. The plane had never left, and I was beginning to realize it wasn't going anywhere. I stood in the hangar, the cold air wrapping itself around me like a heavy cloak. My heartbeat was the only sound I could focus on as I stepped closer to the plane. The vast emptiness of the hangar swallowed any other noise, amplifying the growing unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The plane, sitting there motionless, felt like it had been waiting for me, waiting for something. I had to know what that something was. As I neared the aircraft, my hand instinctively went to my flashlight. It flickered, the beam cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows along the plane's body. I could see the faintest outline of the cockpit windows, but they were too dark to see inside. Still, there was something about the plane that felt wrong. Its presence was imposing, as if it had been abandoned not out of neglect, but by design. I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to leave the hangar, and pretend like none of this had ever happened. But that same urge that had driven me to open the door earlier pushed me forward. I had to see what was inside. I had to see why the plane never left. I moved closer to the plane's side, my flashlight beam bouncing off the surface as I slowly made my way around. The metallic skin of the plane was old, worn, with patches of rust and chipped paint. Yet, despite its obvious age, there was a strange energy about it. The way it seemed to hum quietly beneath the surface, like something alive. Then, I saw it. A door on the side of the plane, slightly ajar. The faintest sliver of light leaked out from the crack, casting an eerie glow against the hangar floor. I couldn't make out much of the interior, but the light was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I should have walked away. I should have turned around and gone back to my duties, but I was already too deep, and something inside me was pulling me closer. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pushed the door open wider. The interior was dark, but the faint light I had seen earlier came from an old cracked bulb near the cockpit. I stepped inside, my feet hesitating on the metal floor as the door clicked shut behind me with a hollow thud. The sound echoed through the empty hangar, leaving me feeling trapped in this strange, otherworldly place. The plane smelled of dust and stale air, but there was something else. A faint, underlying scent that I couldn't place. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't familiar either. It was almost like the smell of old leather mixed with something metallic. As I moved deeper into the plane, my eyes were drawn to the cockpit. It was empty. There were no pilots, no passengers, just the old controls, untouched for years. But then something caught my eye. On the captain's seat, there was a small notebook. It lay open, its pages yellowed with age, but it looked as though someone had been writing in it recently. I reached for it without thinking, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, and the words seemed to bleed together in an incoherent jumble. But there was one sentence that stood out, scrawled hastily across the final page. "The plane can't leave. The plane will never leave." My blood ran cold. I slammed the notebook shut, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I had just read. The words felt like a warning, like a message meant for someone else. But who? And why? What was going on in this place? I heard a sound behind me, a faint rustling, like something moving in the shadows. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. No one. The hangar was as empty as it had been when I first arrived. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone. I turned back to the cockpit, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the plane. The same figure I had seen before, standing motionless in the shadows. My blood ran cold as I stared at the silhouette, the same eerie feeling washing over me that had plagued me from the very first night. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. It was the same tall, dark shape I had seen in the hangar before, the figure that had vanished without a trace. But now, it wasn't fading away. It was here, in the plane, and it was real. I took a step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to run, to leave, but I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in place. My mind screamed at me to escape, but the figure's gaze held me captive. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, slowly, the figure began to move. It was subtle at first, just a shift in position, but it was enough to make my heart race even faster. It was coming closer, and I couldn't stop it. The plane was no longer just a shell. It had become a trap, and I had fallen right into it. I took another step back, but the figure was moving faster now, almost gliding across the floor. I stumbled toward the door, my mind spinning with panic. The figure was almost upon me, its presence suffocating, its eyes fixed on mine. I reached for the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't open. It was stuck, the handle refusing to budge. I yanked at it, my breath shallow and panicked, but it wouldn't give. The figure was closer now, its shape more defined, and I could see its face, pale, gaunt, and hollow. Its eyes were black, like voids, and they stared straight through me. "You can't leave." The voice echoed in my mind, sending a chill through my bones. I could feel the plane vibrating beneath my feet, and for a moment, I thought I heard the engine start. It was faint, but the sound grew louder, as though the plane itself was waking up. I turned, my hands shaking as I tried once more to open the door, but it wouldn't move. The figure was right behind me now, its cold breath on my neck. I was trapped. The plane would never leave. I was trapped. The cold, clammy air inside the plane seemed to press in on me from every direction. The figure was behind me, its breath chilling my neck. I could feel its presence, thick and suffocating, as though it were suffusing the very air inside the plane. The engines hummed louder now, filling the space with a low, vibrating thrum, as though the plane were alive, waiting for something or someone to make a move. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled at the handle, no matter how much I twisted it, the damn thing wouldn't budge. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath ragged as panic set in. I needed to get out. I had to escape. But there was nowhere to go. I whirled around, facing the figure in front of me. It was standing just a few feet away now, close enough that I could see the emptiness in its eyes. Its face was gaunt, pale, like the skin had been stretched too thin, and there was something about it that made my stomach churn. It wasn't human. I knew that much. There was a wrongness to it, an unnatural quality that made every instinct in me scream to run, to flee from whatever nightmare had trapped me inside this cursed plane. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, a hollow sound that reverberated in my mind, not just my ears. It wasn't the figure speaking. It was the plane, the hangar, the very building itself. Everything felt connected now, as if the airport, the plane, the figure, it was all one entity, one force that had ensnared me in its grasp. I backed away, my legs unsteady beneath me. The figure didn't move, didn't need to. It was like the air itself had solidified, trapping me in this claustrophobic space. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the figure, at its hollow eyes, and feel the weight of the words it had spoken press down on me. I had to get out. I turned toward the cockpit, my mind racing for any possible way to escape. There had to be another way out. There had to be. The plane was abandoned after all. It wasn't supposed to be here. None of it was. But I was starting to realize something. The plane wasn't abandoned. The plane was never abandoned. It had been waiting for me. I reached the cockpit, my fingers trembling as I gripped the control panel. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything anymore. But I had to try. I had to fight back, even if I didn't understand what was happening. I pulled the lever, turned the dials, punched in random buttons, anything that would make the plane move, anything that would get me out of here. But nothing happened. The controls were as lifeless as everything else in the plane. The engines hummed louder, but the plane remained still, rooted in place. Behind me, the figure moved again, this time taking a slow, deliberate step forward. I could feel it, feel the pressure of its gaze on my back, like the weight of 1,000 years of waiting. Its presence was closing in on me, its cold, unsettling aura suffocating every inch of space. "You're too late," it whispered. The words didn't make sense. Too late? Too late for what? I spun around, my mind reeling, but the figure was gone. It vanished like smoke in the wind. My heart skipped a beat. My breathing slowed. I stepped back, looking around the cockpit, unsure of where to go next. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. A light, faint at first, but growing stronger. It wasn't coming from the cockpit, but from somewhere deep inside the plane, inside the fuselage. A flickering glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I moved toward it, my legs feeling like lead as I stepped into the narrow hallway that led deeper into the plane. The glow grew brighter as I got closer, and with it, a low, familiar hum. The engines. The sound was coming from the belly of the plane. I reached the source of the light, stepping into a small compartment near the cargo hold. And that's when I saw it. In the center of the room, surrounded by machinery and broken equipment, was a small, unmarked door. The light was coming from within. I didn't know why, but something pulled me toward it, like an invisible force guiding me to the truth. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, and I twisted it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark room beyond. And there, in the center of the room, was a seat, a pilot's seat, and strapped into it, facing the controls, was a figure, a person, or what I thought was a person. It was the same figure, the same dark shape, the same hollow eyes. But this time, it wasn't standing. It was sitting in the seat, as though it had been waiting for me to open the door, as though it had been waiting for me to find it. I took a step forward, but then something changed. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I could hear the engines roaring to life, louder than before. The hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls, through the floor. And then, without warning, the plane lurched forward. The figure turned slowly, its eyes locked on mine. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't just trapped in an abandoned airport. I was trapped on a plane that never left. And whatever had been waiting in that cockpit, whatever had been watching me, was part of something much darker, something that had never intended for me to leave. The plane began to move, the engine screaming as we took off into the night sky, and I realized, with growing horror, that the plane would never land, and neither would I.